Good evening, tributes, and welcome back to Pan Reborn. First of all, before we get started, I'd like to thank all the people who helped make this series possible, including Christian Blanco, whose Tales of the Hunger Games series this series is based off of, and his channel is linked below in the description. I'd also like to thank Andrew McLean, whose artwork is used in this series, so thank you so much, Andrew. His blog is linked below as well. I'd like to thank my editors, Octavian Stesia and Raby, and I really appreciate all the work that they've put into this series to help me edit some of the earlier episodes. And lastly, I'd like to thank everyone who continues to watch and support the series. It means a lot to me. I believe this episode this week is going to be a big chonker of an episode, so please gear up for some fun. Also, in addition, next week is going to be the Q&A. I was going to put it in for this week, but I think this video will be so long that there would be no time for the Q&A because I recorded it already and it's about 15 minutes long. So we're just going to hold that off till next week. That's going to be during the 108th games. So if you guys are ready, let's dive into Panem for today. As Mayor Gardner concluded his yearly speech in District 11, the gathered crowd of district citizens grew restless and prepared for the reaping, with many children clinging together and older teenagers closing their eyes, as if not watching would decrease their chances of being selected. This district, having been particularly affected by the Great War, was always uncomfortably quiet during the reapings and tended to have little hope for its tributes once they were selected. However, this year, the square was especially tense due to the incident the previous year, involving the death of the district's female tribute before the start of the games. Myrtile's family had been taken into custody by the capital, according to Rosalia, though she did not specify any more information on this subject in her coverage. In spite of this, our records indicate that Myrtile's family was quietly executed without much fanfare at a capital prison, perhaps as a way for President Mace to rectify the confusion that had occurred in last year's games involving the supposed revival of a past tribute from District 6, by swiftly neutralizing any threat from Myrtile's connections in District 11. Mercury Valens, victor of last year's 106th Hunger Games, then stepped forward on stage to perform the reapings. She appeared slightly tired from having returned from her journey to District 15 to conduct the reapings there, although she calmly tucked a strand of her bobbed red hair behind her ear as she selected a name from the female reaping bowl and read it aloud. Mercury announced that 13-year-old Camellia Bishop would be the female tribute for the games, and the crowd immediately covered their ears as a loud wailing was heard from the corresponding reaping pen. A small girl with deep brown eyes and matching curls in the rear of the reaping pen, surrounded by a battalion of friends, had begun to cry when her name was called. Frozen in place, she was roughly yanked away from her friends by peacekeepers in order to be brought to the front, angering several older teenagers, who demanded that the peacekeepers be more gentle with her due to her age. However, these outbursts immediately stopped when a peacekeeper rapped the butt of his gun against the ground. Camellia quivered in place on stage and seemed too afraid to even shake hands with Mercury, although Rosalia remarked that her faded flowery dress was surprisingly chic in a rustic way, which in hindsight appeared slightly tone-deaf to some of our analysts, considering a young girl had just been handed a death sentence. Camellia continued to tremble on stage and tried to smooth down her dress with shaking hands as Mercury crossed over to the male reaping bowl and drew a name, reading it to be that of 14-year-old Sorrel Gardner. Suddenly, there was a commotion as Mayor Gardner yelped and cried out in anguish behind Mercury on the stage, having to be held back by peacekeepers as his only child, a tall boy with close-cropped brown hair and sharp, calculating eyes, was pulled along to the front. Sorrel joined Camellia behind Mercury and nodded to both of them without smiling or shaking their hands, though he appeared slightly put off by Camellia's trembling and surveyed her at a careful distance. The pair were presented as the tributes for the 107th Games and quickly sent off to say their goodbyes and be sent to the train station, without much enthusiasm or ceremony, as was usual in the district. Camellia tightly hugged an older brother and a hunched-over mother without saying much, reluctant to let them go when the peacekeepers finally arrived to separate them. In the other room, Sorrel attempted to console his weeping parents, reminding them that they were still being broadcast on camera somewhere to someone, and that Mayor Gardner crying could be perceived as a sign of weakness by the Capitol, his eyes shifting around and clouding with worry. Despite his reservations, he still gave them both a light and tentative hug as the peacekeepers entered to take the tributes to the train. The pair were greeted by their mentor, Imogen Catesby, at the doors to the train upon arrival at the train station. A petite but stern-faced woman with bright green hair and an eyebrow slit, she shepherded them into the train carriage and flipped on the coverage of the other reapings, keeping a watchful eye on them as she ordered food for the three. Camellia began to eat a turkey leg so quickly that she appeared nauseous within a few minutes of the start of their lunch, causing Imogen to berate her and tell her to slow down. Sorrel glanced at his district partner with an appraising eye during this spectacle, and remarked that she snuffled like a dog while eating, to which Camellia stuck out her tongue in a surprising attitude change, before quickly casting her eyes down again and staring shyly into her plate of food. Sorrel shoved his plate away from him just moments after digging into it, though when Imogen demanded to know why he was not eating, he quietly stated that it was too rich for him and that he could not stomach it without feeling ill. Despite her upsetness at their situation, Camellia managed to pay an impressive amount of attention to the reapings on the television, as Imogen pointed out notable moments and occurrences. Surprisingly, there was an outlier volunteer this year. Blossom, the girl from 7, had volunteered in place of a younger girl who had originally been reaped. Sorrel and Camellia glanced at each other with interest, making mental notes of this unusual turn of events. Imogen had been watching her tributes for their reactions during the other district's reapings, and gave an almost victorious grin as she witnessed them looking the most alive they had been since their own reapings earlier. Over the rest of the train ride, Camellia appeared to calm down and agreeably worked with Sorrel on his extensive note-taking, calling out tribute names and other important details for him to then write down on a notepad. The pair soon turned Imogen's pinched expression into one of interest, as she was seen muttering that finally 11 might have some contenders this year. Due to their lengthy journey to the capital, as soon as there was a long advertisement break between reapings, Camellia drifted off to take a nap, while Sorrel snacked on some dried fruit from a platter and stared out the windows of the train, appearing deep in thought. The train soon pulled into Mace Station amid a crowd of curious onlookers, most having just arrived from watching the tributes from 15 touch down in their hovercraft nearby. Sorrel appeared quite uncomfortable that many were reaching out in an attempt to flag him down and gain his attention, flinching when a crowd member's hand closed around his arm for a moment. He turned and glowered at the offender, an elderly woman with a violet beehive hairdo, having to be led away a moment later by Imogen, who was attempting to do damage control on behalf of her tributes. Camellia was surrounded by a crowd of chattering teenage Capitolites, although she kept attempting to dodge their hands, which were trying to touch her hair against her will. After this awkward encounter, Imogen quickly hurried her tributes away to their accommodations. The pair from 11 were shepherded into their apartment and introduced to their stylist, Rinaldo Catesby, whom Imogen not only introduced as their stylist but also as her husband. Rinaldo unveiled for them a flowing pink dress and suit patterned in strawberries, sparking sounds of delight and amazement from both the tributes and Imogen. However, they soon realized that their celebrating had been premature, as Camellia's dress was several inches too long and sagged against her bony frame, while Sorrel had to keep adjusting his sinking pants to avoid flashing everyone else in the room. Due to their early arrival, the pair fortunately had time to be measured and properly fitted for the costumes, and Rinaldo set about doing this. To occupy her fidgety tributes, who had begun to lose interest in staying put during their fittings and were complaining about the safety pins poking their sides, Imogen turned the apartment television on and flipped to the Capital TV channel, where Rosalia Sanchez was commentating on reruns of the reapings after an extensive commercial break. Imogen turned to her tributes and instructed them to watch carefully as footage from District 5 transitioned into footage from District 4, where Mercury Balance was just stepping up to perform the female tribute's reaping. Through the television screen, Sorrel and Camellia watched Mercury draw and read the name of 12-year-old Morella Brindisi as the camera centered on a small girl with twin red braids in a tattered blue dress, eyes watering as she was tugged forward to the stage. However, just seconds before she was deposited behind Mercury by a peacekeeper, a thin girl in the crowd with oily black hair and dark almond eyes limped forward, scratchily calling out that she wished to volunteer and muttering that she had nothing to lose anyway, while tugging at one of her fishhook earrings to detach it from a strand of dirty hair. The peacekeeper that had been dragging Morella along behind him grumpily turned around and tossed the small girl, our analysts use this term for the sake of formality, he actually drop-kicked her, back into the crowd, stamping over to the new volunteer and unceremoniously dumping her next to Mercury. Rosalia identified the girl as 15-year-old Rill Rivulet, who hailed from one of the poorest regions in the district and was the daughter of a street-side shell jewelry vendor. The male reaping proceeded as normal once Rill was up on the stage, had shaken hands with a yawning Mercury, and the crowd had settled down from the excitement of the female reaping. Mercury then moved to the male reaping bowl as she recovered from her surprise and drew the name of 17-year-old Lee Brindisi, a tall but lean and muscular fisherman's apprentice with bright red curls, a light smattering of freckles, and hazel eyes. Ironically, Lee was the elder brother of Morella, which caused the already upset girl in the crowd to burst into howling tears and be comforted by several friends. As Lee was tugged to the front by peacekeepers, he tried to call out to comfort Morella, but one of the peacekeepers yanked on him and he stumbled forward before he could say anything. Lee shook hands with Mercury and nodded to Rill, who offered him a careful nod in response. As they were escorted off stage to say their goodbyes to family and depart for the train, Rosalia commented that they seemed to be a mismatched pair. Lee patted a few flaming-haired children, presumably his younger siblings, on the head as they scrambled around him and their very tired parents. Rill buried her face in her frail mother's shoulder, appearing to provide more support to her mother than her mother was providing to her, despite the circumstances. As the pair from 4 boarded the train, they were greeted by Leonine Oswald, their mentor. Looking a bit scruffier than in recent years, like a proud lion down on its luck, he ushered them to the table and immediately began quizzing them about their practical skills and abilities, though the pair appeared somewhat overwhelmed and still processing the fact that they were on their way to the capital. Lee explained that he was fairly patient, being a fisherman's apprentice and sitting out in the ocean in a small dinghy for hours each day. He also admitted that he was rather good with ropes and nets, hoping to use these abilities in the arena, while also winking to his mentor and remarking that his knot-tying skills had been some of his past girlfriend's favorite things about him. He turned to see if Rill had been paying attention, hoping that she had been listening, but she was much more interested in twirling a butter knife between her fingers than the conversation. Instead, she offered a menacing smile to him while continuing to twirl the knife around, wiping the cheeky grin from Lee's face and causing him to appear slightly put out. Rill then lazily admitted that she did not have most of the classic skills associated with District 4, as she and her mother operated a small seaside jewelry stand, where they fashioned jewelry from seashells, twine, and fishhook wire, and sold it for a living. Leonine appeared slightly disappointed at this admission, but he agreed that both of them could find a use for their talents in the arena. After going over a brief plan of action for their training, heavily emphasizing that they should learn more skills instead of sticking with their comfort zones of fishhooks and nets, he encouraged them both to get some rest before they arrived at Mace Station. Once the train pulled into the station and opened its doors to allow the Tributes and Leonine to exit, they emerged into a curious crowd. Many Capitolites called out the names of both Lee and Rill, attempting to get their attention, but the pair each gravitated towards some of the calmer onlookers away from the center of the platform. After a moment, Rill shyly allowed a young girl to touch her grubby cowrie shell necklace, even taking it off so the girl could run her fingers over the smooth shells. Lee proved popular with the same crowd of teenagers who had been interested in Camellia earlier, as one boy crudely asked him an inappropriate question about the size of his trident, causing Lee to stare in shock and flush bright red. Leonine made an executive decision at this point to steer his tributes out of the crowd and away to their apartments, clearly sensing that once again, Capitolites had gotten a bit out of hand at the train station. The Fours then met with their assigned stylist, a sharp-minded former Anderson fashion stylist named Antenor Southwell, at their accommodations quarters and marveled at the designs he had laid out. Lee was to wear a flowy and low-cut white shirt with matching tan pants designed to look like shimmering sand, while Rill would complement the outfit in a sweeping white gown that faded into the same shimmering sandy material at the bottom. The tributes were so enthralled by Antenor's designs that it took several minutes for Leonine to snap them out of their reverie and get them to try on the costumes. Surprisingly, the costumes fit well, and they spent several minutes modeling them for their impressed mentor and stylist. However, their prep team loudly complained that it was impossible to tame Lee's curly mane and Rill's greasy strands due to their tangled nature from living by the sea, and resorted to waging violent warfare on their heads with an army of combs, brushes, detangling sprays, and hair oils. The pair were finally cleared to leave for the parade area, massaging their scalps and laughing at each other's grumpy expressions. Reportedly, during the waiting period before the parade, Camellia bravely defended Sorrel from Sunella from one, who had insulted his parade outfit and called it girly. Sorrel had been about to fire back, but Camellia got there first and swiftly stepped on Sunella's foot before sticking her nose in the air and stamping off. Sunella shrieked in annoyance at her sore toes, but by the time she recovered from the shock, Camellia had vanished behind a group of tributes chatting at the nearby District 3 chariot. The Fours did not have nearly as exciting of a pre-parade period, but they still appeared to be enjoying themselves as they watched Jacques from 15 trip over his own tailcoat and almost faceplant into a horse while on his way to his chariot. The parade itself passed uneventfully as many tributes tried to get the attention of capital citizens with bright smiles and waves. While Lee and Rill grudgingly held their hands up together in a show of unity, Sorrel and Camellia looked around at the assembled crowd with disinterest and seemed to not even be paying attention during President Mace's speech about the glory of Panem, to Rosalia Sanchez's disbelief. In fact, Camellia appeared to be picking at a hangnail during the speech instead of listening to President Mace. The tribute parade concluded equally as dully, with no horse mishaps like there had been in past years. It was revealed that the pair from 4 had impressed the Capitol crowd with their sand-inspired outfits and calm energy so much that Rosalia decided to name them the best dressed of this year, to Leonine's great delight, as he had reportedly felt quite robbed in past years due to Antenor's excellent designs. However, at the conclusion of the parade, a very angry Sunella from 1 had managed to obtain a glass of red fruit punch after claiming she felt faint at the parade and asking an Avox to provide her with something to relieve her of her illness. Striding over to the 4s, who were quietly discussing some of their shared interests back in their district, she interrupted their conversation and placed one hand on her hip as they turned to her. Cocking her head, she furiously declared that the pair from 1 had deserved to win Best Dressed, not the pair from 4, gesturing wildly at her glittering black dress with her other hand that contained the glass, and stating that they did not deserve to be real careers, either. Sunella then sneered and stated that Rill had looked like a wet rat in her costume, causing Lee to glare and tell her to leave them alone. Yet Sunella did not take kindly to being ordered around and without further comment threw the glass of punch at the pair, splattering both of their pristine outfits in sticky, sugary red fruit juice. Lee stared down at his ruined costume and back up at Sunella before leaping at her and tackling her to the ground, raising fright and alarm from the nearby Avoxes, who hastily alerted peacekeepers. Rill tried to smooth back her sopping hair in the background, though she appeared undisturbed about the mess compared to Lee's reaction. Once peacekeepers had separated the two and Sunella spit out some blood at Lee, all tributes were immediately sent back to their apartments, the pair from 4 sopping wet and the pair from 1 glaring daggers at them from afar. Once the parade was over and the tributes returned safely to their apartments, Leonine exclaimed over his tribute's sorry state and quickly sent them to the bathrooms to clean themselves up. Lee asked Rill, as they both washed out their tangled hair in the sinks, how she had managed to not react to the fruit punch being thrown at them, to which she simply responded that due to her social status, far worse things than fruit punch had been hurled at her in her lifetime. Surprisingly, Lee admitted that he did not realize people in their district could be so cruel, though Rill slowly looked up at him through her wet hair and quietly replied that this was because he had grown up in a wealthier area, with 2 parents and a full stomach every night. His eyes widened for a moment as he took in her bony frame and hollow cheekbones, before he nodded understandingly a moment later, and they both departed for their respective showers in silence. Sorrel and Camellia, on the other hand, had greatly enjoyed watching the fruit punch spectacle, and upon realizing that Imogen was using the restroom when they arrived back at their apartment, gleefully took the opportunity to order several large desserts to be brought to the table and dug into them with gusto, appearing the most enthusiastic they had been since the start of the training period. Even Sorrel, who had complained about the food being too decadent on the train ride to the capital, temporarily overcame his reservations and cool attitude to serve himself a large slice of pineapple upside-down cake and wolf it down in just a few bites. The moment Imogen emerged from the restroom and observed the pair in a food coma from having devoured most of the desserts on the table, she yelped in alarm and berated them so loudly that Heifer Muller shouted from the floor below them to keep the noise down, followed by a loud expletive, as his voice had embarrassingly cracked while saying this. The rest of the night passed peacefully for most tributes, though Sunella had to be examined by a medic to ensure she had not sustained any lasting damage from her conflict with Lee. All of the mentors ushered their mentees to bed for the night, reminding them that it was important to get some quality rest before interviewing with Rosalia the next day. Arriving bright and early to the training center, this year's tributes were greeted by a stern-faced Gloria Steele, pristine as ever in her silver jumpsuit but with an additional streak of white through her gray hair that was almost certainly not present the previous year. After the events of the past 2 years, she now wielded both a stun gun and an exploding action figure, although the exploding action figure had been specially rigged to only be a smoke bomb rather than actually injure any tributes. Once the rules had been read as usual and the tributes had been dismissed to work individually at stations, Gloria returned to the upper observation deck to watch the tributes and ensure there were no shenanigans or brawls. Sorrel quickly made his way from station to station over the 3 days and tried his hand at learning to use axes and swords. He occasionally crossed paths with Camellia, who had been concentrating her skills on the various survival stations offered, and these two proved to be a formidable pair despite most viewers having originally perceived Camellia as weak for her behavior during the reapings. Both Sorrel and Camellia were seen to be chatting with and working with other tributes at this time, notably Spindle and Crinoline from 8. As for the pair from 4, Lee eagerly agreed to work with Tupelo from 7 at the weightlifting station to try out their skills on each other, while Real gravitated towards the fishhook station. It was then noted that she was approached by Blossom from 7, who tentatively asked if she could teach her how to make the elaborate shapes with fishhooks that she was constructing at the station. Since these two districts had traditionally been strong on their own but excluded from the Selective Career Alliance, they had naturally gravitated towards working together in recent years. Rill agreed to share her fishhook skills in exchange for Blossom teaching her to use axes. The girls got along well as they worked on both these skills, sharing information about their personal lives, though their social classes were vastly different and this clearly showed in their occasionally disjointed discussion. Lee accidentally dropped a heavy weight on his own toe while trying to show off at the weightlifting station, resulting in laughter from the nearby career pack, especially Sunella, but nodded and brushed it off when Tupelo reminded him that he would have a chance at revenge in the arena. Sorrel and Camellia had been watching this exchange between the two alliances unfold from afar, and Camellia whispered something to Sorrel about it that was not caught by cameras but clearly amused him greatly. After the 3 days, once the tributes had honed their skills to the best of their abilities, they were each sent in to display their talents to the game makers. It was widely reported this year that there was much tighter security surrounding the Game Maker performances, mostly due to last year's incident in which a tribute had caused an uproar after using an unblunted weapon on herself in the room. However, many unscrupulous tabloids had once again been able to obtain information on each tribute's performance, which we were able to recover when compiling this file. According to these records, Lee demonstrated both his ability to snare various items with an airtight, hand-woven net from afar, as well as his strong weightlifting abilities from working with Tupelo. Rill used her time to make a complex chain by rapidly bending a series of fishhooks and attaching them to each other, creating a tight chain, before lashing this chain around and expertly lassoing a dummy in the corner. Sorrel put on a highly impressive display with a sword, slicing through a series of holograms that emerged at him from the walls without hesitation. Meanwhile, Camellia correctly identified over 80 plants and fruits and only missed a few in determining which were poisonous or edible. Because all tributes had showcased fine skills this year, head game makers Lock and Lock later stated that it had been difficult for the game makers to assign training scores this year. Eventually, it was revealed that Adriana from 2 had come out at the top of the pack with an 11, followed closely by Azer from 1, Blossom from 7, and Nimari from 10 with 10s each. Lee achieved a respectable 8 and Sorrel a 9, while Rill and Camellia both received 7s for their middling performances. At the bottom of the pack were Lightning from 5 and Sarah from 9, with 5s each. The interviews for Capital TV were conducted the following evening as Rosalia Sanchez arrived in a dress patterned with an array of tiny clothing items. This caused a buzz in the audience as they attempted to guess how the colorful dress related to this year's arena. After some brief banter with those in the first few rows, Rosalie commenced the evening's scheduled interviews. Relatively early on in the lineup was Rill, who arrived on stage in a glittering blue gown dripping with what appeared to be real sapphires in the shape of water droplets. The two joked for a few minutes about each other's dresses and chatted about Rill's life back in District 4, as Rosalia invited her to show off the jewelry she was wearing for the evening. Rill carefully displayed her scallop shell earrings and necklace to the crowd, revealing that they were from her own collection back in District 4 that she handmade alongside her mother. Capital citizens quickly clamored for the jewelry as Rill smiled in a slightly forced manner and tossed them into the crowd, with shrieks of excitement arising from the lucky winners and earning her a healthy round of applause. Lee was welcomed in a few moments later once the hysteria over the jewelry had died down, and wore a sleeveless suit dripping in deep blue sapphires, showing off his various nautical arm tattoos for the crowd, and even causing Rosalia to have to calm down several audience members in the front few rows who were attempting to touch Lee's arms from the viewing area. He proved quite popular with the crowds, beaming and waving while barely acknowledging Rosalia, although the irked interview host soon shooed him off to stay on schedule. Near the very end of the lineup for the night was Camellia, who made a strong impression right away by plopping down on her designated interview chair and fluffing her apple red dress. Rosalia commented particularly upon Camellia's dark brown choker with a leaf accessory on the side, remarking that it complemented her dark curls nicely. Camellia thanked her for the compliment, but replied that she felt like a walking fruit, amusing the Capital audience. The interview soon concluded after a series of increasingly poor quality fruit puns, and it was with great relief that the audience welcomed Sorrel on stage to be interviewed. Wearing a bright red suit and matching choker, he could not have looked less enthused to be in the Capital TV studios that night. Sorrel politely answered each of Rosalia's questions in turn, occasionally glancing out at the crowd as if evaluating what kind of answer they would appreciate the most. He easily answered her questions, even the ones designed to reveal his own deep thoughts about other tributes, garnering respectful applause from the Capitalites in the live audience as he exited the stage. Rosalia was eager to welcome head game makers Lock and Lock on stage with her next, as they arrived in beige jumpsuits and waved to the excited crowd. The energy was almost tangible as they sat down and greeted Rosalia before she launched into her usual interview questions. Capital citizens had been anticipating their interview since the conclusion of the massively successful 106 games the prior year, and they did not disappoint with raising excitement for the 107th games. In fact, they hinted that these games could possibly be the most chaotic and unexpected yet, even considering the sudden and explosive events in the previous year's games. However, they refused to give any more information aside from reminding the audience to refer to Rosalia's dress for clues as to the arena. The Capitol crowd was left in an uproar this year, calling for the head game makers to come back when they began to exit the stage, grinning at the chaos they had created. Rosalia had to calm the crowd down once more by promising them that they would soon see what the head game makers were talking about in the arena. After a few short concluding statements, she gracefully waved to the assembled crowd before finishing off with her catchphrase, "Good night, Pan Am." The tributes were awakened early the next morning and sent to the lunchrooms after a brief breakfast period. This year's tribute uniforms were revealed to be simple printed tees with their district number on the front, black pants, and plain black shoes. Leonine optimistically reminded Lee and Rill to use their respective strengths to their advantage in the arena as he saw them off, nodding encouragingly and mouthing "sponsors." Elsewhere, at the District 11 lunchrooms, Imogen smoothed out the wrinkles in her tribute's shirts and told them to make their district proud. Sorrel nodded solemnly in response, while Camellia crossed her arms and squared her shoulders. As all mentors were instructed to leave the tributes in their tubes and move back, Leonine and Imogen waved their final goodbyes to their mentees. The tribute's podiums rose up into a great atrium with a domed glass ceiling, which was revealed to be at the center of a grand and pristine shopping mall. It had been perfectly preserved since the last time shoppers had graced its halls, with everything untouched and not a single piece of chewing gum or fast food wrapper in sight, though the lack of other shoppers seemed to unnerve some. The tributes could see that their podiums had arisen on the lower of two floors in the very center of the mall itself, although there were directories scattered throughout the area. More surprisingly, as all of Pan Am looked on in shock, there appeared to be no cornucopia. As the countdown continued to tick towards 0, head game makers Locke and Locke announced that there was indeed no cornucopia, merely a large fountain around which the podiums were situated, and that all supplies for the games could be found within the mall if tributes knew where to look. Sorrel and Camellia glanced at each other cautiously before nodding and looking up towards the second floor of the mall, accessible by elevator and escalator just like last year, while Lee and Tupelo grinned at the athletic footwear store across from them. Rill nodded at Blossom and they set their eyes on a candy shop, which was located closely behind both of them. The general panic that had ensued as tributes realized they needed to find a place to hide was quickly cut off by the gong declaring the commencement of the 107th Hunger Games. Immediately, a clamor broke out as tribute sneakers grated on the polished floors in their haste to flee the central area. Squeak, from 3, was the only one to run forward, scaling the fountain in the middle and cowering on top of it as he watched the other tributes scatter. Sorrel and Camellia held hands to stay together as they hurried towards the escalators to the west of the podium area, with Sorrel determinedly pressing ahead and Camellia's legs pumping to keep up. Realizing that other tributes were likely heading in their direction, they began to jog up the escalator instead of waiting for it to transport them. Just as Camellia reached the top, seconds after Sorrel, she cried out in anguish and jabbed a finger at Lightning from 5, who had grabbed onto her ankle from below and was trying to drag her back down onto the escalator. Sorrel grunted and heaved forth, pulling Camellia away, but she screamed in pain as Lightning held on fast and tried to twist her ankle. Wrenching his body around, Sorrel pushed Camellia ahead of him and swung over to block Lightning from continuing to grab at her. Elbowing Camellia behind him to keep her safely out of range, Sorrel shoved Lightning's head backward and landed a wild kick squarely in the center of his face, sending Lightning flying down the escalator in a crumpled heap while hitting every moving step along the way and sounding his cannon. The pair from 11 continued running, Camellia slightly limping, and made their way to the second floor. Meanwhile, Lee and Tupelo abandoned their plans to hide out near the cornucopia upon seeing some of the careers enter the sporting goods store they had wanted to use as a hiding spot. The boys changed course and hurried in the other direction instead, sprinting up the escalator to the upper floor and fleeing away from the main area of the mall into a hallway of expansive luxury stores to the east of the podiums. Diving behind 2 tall potted plants at a storefront to avoid the pounding footsteps they heard behind them on the escalator, and listening carefully as other tributes hurried past their hiding spot, they exhaled and began to look around the luxury corridor. Rill and Blossom scrambled around the corner and into the candy shop, wincing as they heard the cannon of Jacques from 15 behind them as a result of Sunella from 1 finding a baseball bat in a nearby sporting goods store and wielding it to great effect against the first non-ally that she saw. Fuchsia from 5 followed shortly after, as Adriana from 2 had found a lacrosse stick from a pile in the same store and slammed it into her face, netting her head in the pocket and yanking it to the side to snap Fuchsia's neck as her cannon sounded out. The girls from 4 and 7 scrambled into the candy store amid shouts and squeaking shoes outside, diving behind the checkout counter and peering over the top at the chaos unfolding outside in the atrium. Rill grinned at Blossom and invited her to raid the gumball machine, casually commenting that if they were in a candy store, they might as well check out the goods. Blossom appeared more hesitant, as if holding back an instinctive desire to avoid stealing, though she reluctantly accepted a gumball offered by her ally. The girls hid behind the counter for the rest of the evening, sampling small amounts of different candies from the rear display wall, but not daring to venture beyond the counter. Lee and Tupelo wandered the luxury corridor, pointing and gaping at the chandeliers in storefronts and the glittering jewelry on display in windows, while occasionally jokingly imitating wealthy capitalites sauntering through the stores. As they watched the sun set over the atrium's stained glass ceiling, they wandered into a luxury clothing store and marveled at the racks of shoes and clothing, as well as the massive handbag display on a front table. Lee grinned and asked Tupelo if they were allowed to try on the clothes, to which Tupelo responded that he doubted the game makers would hurl a fireball at them if they did. The boys spent another hour munching on food from the gourmet food court down the hall from the clothing store and trying all kinds of coats and accessories from the racks and shelves. Lee eventually wandered into the back area and admired himself in the mirror for a moment, quaffing his hair and feeling his biceps before winking at himself and turning back to re-enter the main area of the store. Yet as he stepped out from the fitting rooms, he was greeted by a gruesome sight. As Lee watched in horrified shock from behind the cash register, Nimari from 10 sprinted into the store and tackled Tupelo to the ground from behind, gagging him with a handkerchief he pulled from his pocket and wrapping Tupelo's own borrowed scarf tightly against his neck to the point of choking. Nimari glanced up as he did this, although he just missed Lee ducking down behind the counter as the boy from 4 peered around the side of the cash register and furrowed his brow with worry. Nimari pulled the scarf tight, causing Tupelo to splutter and his hands to fly up in a frantic attempt to free himself from his unforgiving grip. The two boys continued to struggle for a moment as Tupelo tried to step on Nimari's foot as a distraction, while uttering a strangled cry that sounded like he was asking for Lee to help him, but ultimately slipped and missed as the scarf tightened around his throat. With a vindictive smile, Nimari kept the scarf wrapped firmly around his neck as Tupelo wheezed and coughed. After a minute of struggling, he finally gave out and crumpled to the floor, his cannon sounding. Lee peered out in fright from behind the cash register and watched Nimari search the rest of the room, holding his breath and ducking down low for fear that he would be seen or heard. His eyes widened a moment later as he heard Nimari approaching the checkout counter from the side, and he wildly searched around for something to distract the other boy. After a moment, he seized upon a tinkling bracelet and threw it as hard as he could into a glass shelf display several feet away. Just as Nimari rounded the corner, he was startled away by the noise and hurried to go investigate, while Lee snuck out the back of the checkout area and retreated back into the fitting rooms. Fortunately for Lee, though Nimari continued to search the store, he was soon distracted by his own grumbling stomach and headed out in search of food at the food court down the corridor. Lee breathed a sigh of relief as he heard Nimari's retreating footsteps and continued to keep a lookout inside the luxury clothing store for the rest of the evening, making himself a nest of clothes in one of the fitting rooms as he prepared to sleep for the night and restlessly attempted to prepare a plan of action now that his closest ally was gone. Sorrel and Camellia had been roaming the other wing of the arena, hiding in various different stores when they heard other tributes in their area. To their delight, they were the first to locate the mall management office on the second floor, slightly to the east of the escalators. The pair charged into the office, delighted at their find, and quickly barricaded the door handle behind them with a wet floor sign. Sorrel stood at the ready, peeking through the peephole to ensure no other tributes found them, while Camellia sat down and stared at the bank of computers. After several seconds of staring in confusion at the computers with no idea of how to operate them, Camellia asked Sorrel if they should perhaps have allied with a tribute from District 3, who would certainly know how to operate the technology better than them. Sorrel quickly fired back that they did not have any tributes from 3 with them, and that he believed she could figure it out without them going on a wild goose chase for someone who would know how to operate the computers. Although Camellia grumbled in annoyance at this declaration and set to work, powering on the main central computer after a few minutes of searching for the power button. It took her several more minutes of searching to locate the login information for the computer on a coffee-stained sticky note taped to the back of a filing cabinet. By this time, Sorrel had begun to grow impatient and kept repeatedly asking her if she was making any progress, complaining that he was getting hungry and wanted to leave for a bit to find some food. Camellia patiently replied that she was just trying her best and that he would have to wait a few minutes for her to get to the computers to function. After comically inputting the found username and password by typing with a single index finger and staring suspiciously at the computer for a moment, she was rewarded with access to its contents. Camellia began to index the files in the computer, sifting through financial reports and audits to locate anything of use to herself and Sorrel. Once she had gone through all of the documentation on the computer, pulling up a map of the mall, she began to look through the various applications. Suddenly, Camellia gasped and tugged on Sorrel's arm in excitement, showing him something on the screen. While both their heads together covered the contents of the computer screen from cameras, it was visible a moment later when Sorrel shifted slightly to the left. Camellia had succeeded in locating the mall security camera's live footage. The pair gazed in awe as all of the computer screens lit up with black and white footage of every single room and hall in the entire mall, showing not just the other tributes but also their locations. Sorrel and Camellia stared at each other and back at the screens in delight, realizing the power they held by having access to this footage. Sorrel then turned and flipped on the light switch in the room, illuminating a control panel in the corner near the far right computers, before casting a sly grin aside and inspecting the panel. On it, he found control switches for lights in several arena hallways, as well as those for ventilation in most stores. Camellia turned in her swivel chair and asked Sorrel what he had found, as he stepped back to show her the control panel. Sorrel suggested that they use the control panel to tamper with the lighting and ventilation, but Camellia crossed her arms and shook her head firmly, arguing that it would be better to simply observe the other tributes and get a feel for their skills and habits. Sorrel continued to press the point, arguing back that they should eliminate the competition while they could, but Camellia continued to resist and press her point. Eventually, placing 2 fingers to his temple, Sorrel told Camellia it would be best if she went and looked for some food at one of the nearby eateries on the upper level, as he was too tired to think straight. Camellia sighed and agreed, but told Sorrel he should not use the control panel while she was gone. He reluctantly agreed and removed the wet floor sign from the door, allowing her to exit the room and watching her retreating back down the hallway. The moment Camellia turned a corner, Sorrel's face hardened and he turned back to the bank of computer screens with their flickering images and faint audio. Looking from the control panel to the central monitor, he observed that the nearest tribute to their location was Bryn from 6, who was wandering around inside a jewelry store a block away from their location in the mall. While she appeared unarmed, Sorrel noted that she seemed to be taking an interest in potentially taking some sharp gem analysis tools from the store to wield in the arena. Pulling up the computer interface for ventilation in that jewelry store, Sorrel clicked through a few settings and set various bars to 0. As he glanced around and listened to ensure Camellia was not yet back from her food search, he calmly walked over to the control panel and flipped the ventilation settings. Because the settings corresponded to those on the computer interface, viewers could see that Sorrel was causing the doors to automatically shut and air to rapidly drain from this jewelry store. Bryn stared around in fright and confusion as the doors swung closed behind her, and tugging on the handles was doing nothing to open them. Sorrel watched with an expressionless face from the control room as she began to panic and cry. Bryn hiccuped and began searching the room for something to pry open one of the vents and aid her escape, but the air was draining so quickly that she began to cough and fell to the ground. She abandoned her search and began to wheeze, faintly turning blue, although Sorrel could not see this from the surveillance room. After only a few seconds, she lost consciousness and lay in a heap on the jewelry store floor. Sorrel picked his nails, waiting for the cannon and craning his neck to see through the peephole if Camellia was returning. He only looked up a few minutes later once Bryn's cannon sounded out and her body was extricated from the room by a hovercraft arm poking out through a vent. Immediately, Sorrel flipped all of the controls to how they had been before and reset the doors to be open, just as Camellia entered the room again. Suspecting nothing out of the ordinary, she set down a stack of boxes from a restaurant around the corner, and they feasted for the rest of the evening while toasting a pair of sparkling water bottles to their success in finding the management office and security feed. That evening, the portraits of Lightning and Fuchsia from 5, Bryn from 6, Tupelo from 7, and Jacques from 15 were projected into each room for all tributes to see, as they had been last year in the Convention Center arena. Rosalia Sanchez remarked that this was potentially the least violent first day she had seen yet in any of the recent games, likely owing to the lack of a cornucopia and addition of incentives to scatter throughout the arena. Rill and Blossom awoke the next morning to a great crash sounding from down the hall near the candy store, covering their ears in confusion and peeking out to see what was going on. However, they did not have a good glimpse from their vantage point inside the store, and they reluctantly tiptoed out of the store to investigate the noise. Further down the hall towards the eastern end of the building was a large department store, one of the former anchors of the mall. The girls crept up to its entrance and hid behind a shoe display, looking in. Hearing another crash from further inside the department store, the girls glanced at each other and tentatively inched closer to the center. The crash had come from what sounded like the children's clothing and supply section in the rear, so they continued moving inward and glancing around at the various clothing sections and displays along the way. Rill muttered to Blossom that she thought she recalled viewing a rerun of a past games involving mannequins that came to life while on the train to the Capitol, so she urged caution around the store mannequins. As the pair approached the children's section, they were startled to see no moving mannequins, but rather two tributes engaged in a vicious fight, rolling and tumbling around on the floor in an attempt to get the upper hand. Rosalia identified these tributes as Tori from 6 and Colonel from 9. In an even more bizarre twist, the pair appeared to be fighting over a children's toy, a plastic, light-up, sword-like apparatus dubbed a space sword on its display case. Rosalia seemed just as confused as Rill and Blossom as to why such a toy was worth a wrestling match, although Blossom commented a moment later that admittedly a light-up weapon, however ineffective, would still be fun to wield. The two boys continued to tussle over the space sword, crashing into displays and making a general commotion, as Rill and Blossom shrugged and began to leave. To their shock, they turned around to find that Tori's cannon was sounding, as Colonel had gotten impatient upon gaining the upper hand in the fight and bonked him over the head with the space sword before crushing his windpipe. The girls stared in awe and fright, rooted to the spot in alarm as they heard Colonel moving toward them. Rill seized Blossom's hand and urged her to run, but Blossom was still staring in awe at what she had just witnessed. Colonel came charging around the corner at the girls and threw himself into Blossom, brutally shouldering her into the ground as Rill screamed. Though Colonel was smaller and weaker than Blossom, he had the element of surprise on his side, seizing her around the throat and trying to do the same to her as he had just done to Tori. Rill continued to spin around in fright and attempted to search for something to help free her ally from Colonel's grip. Since they were in the front area of the store, Rill scanned the displays for any sign of a tool or item that could help her. At last, her eyes landed on one sparkling object in a polished glass display case with an open back, and she scrambled over to it while looking over her shoulder to make sure Colonel was not paying attention. Rill snatched the item up, and as she held it up to the faint morning light emanating from the atrium outside, audiences around Panem could see that it was a razor-sharp, twinkling red stiletto heel. Brandishing the heel and leveling it at Colonel, she charged forward and drove it down at his neck from behind. Colonel slipped out of the way just in time, but it was enough to let go of Blossom's neck. Rill tripped on his leg and fell forward, yet managed to drive the stiletto heel firmly down again, and this time it embedded itself in his heart. Colonel screamed in agony and let go completely of Blossom as Rill pulled the blood-soaked heel back out of him and stabbed it in and out of his neck multiple times. Colonel's cannon sounded moments later amid Rill's labored breathing and Blossom's sigh of relief. The two girls wiped off the heel on Colonel's shirt and ran back into the candy shop, never looking back along the way. Once they were safe again, Blossom looked deeply into Rill's eyes and admitted that she greatly appreciated being saved by her. Rill smiled and replied that she had been glad to help, stating that she had plenty of experience with handling rowdy customers at her mother's stand before digging into some more of their candy supply. She went on to inquire about why Blossom had volunteered at the reaping, commenting that she had found it highly unusual for a tribute from District 7 to volunteer for the games. Blossom gave a small but sad smile in response and admitted that she had volunteered on behalf of her sister, who had originally been reaped, before admitting that she had seen Rill volunteer as well, and that they were clearly meant to be allies. The other girl responded with a soft sound of sympathy and inquired about Blossom's family, as the two girls spent most of the morning chatting about their home life. Rosalia remarked from the commentator booth that in recent years an alliance between Districts 4 and 7 had become prevalent, and the two girls certainly seemed to solidify this. It was further solidified a few minutes later when they were sponsored some seaweed bread rolls and water by the citizens of District 4 to share with each other without worrying about finding food elsewhere. Blossom popped an entire roll in her mouth and began to tear off some of the crustier, slightly burnt parts at the edge to throw away, but suddenly Rill slapped it out of her hand. Blossom choked on part of the roll and furiously demanded amid her coughing to know why her ally had done this, to which Rill sheepishly apologized and admitted that she was not used to seeing people waste food where she came from. Nodding with a quiet understanding, Blossom apologized as well and promised that she would not waste any more parts of any of their food in the future, earning a small nod of approval from Rill. However, despite their enjoyable morning, the girls soon became troubled in the afternoon upon noticing that Colette from 15 had been camping right outside the candy store, keenly watching the atrium and armed with a pair of table tennis paddles. Rill and Blossom quietly discussed what to do about this difficult situation, struggling to decide between remaining hidden and hoping Colette would leave, or attacking and attempting to use the element of surprise to their advantage. As they tried to figure out what to do about Colette, they noticed her move over to sit at the edge of the fountain, and both girls glanced at each other with measured calm. In unison, they crept out from behind the counter and sprinted through the doors to the center of the atrium, diving at Colette from behind and pinning her down into the water. Rill held her hands behind her back while Blossom ferociously dunked Colette's head into the water, avoiding the burbling and spray from her attempts to free herself from their hands. Eventually, she went limp in the water and her cannon sounded amid Rill and Blossom's labored breathing. The girls scrambled back into the candy store to avoid any tributes that might be alerted by the noise, barely avoiding Haryana from 10, who was coming around the corner. Haryana narrowed her eyes at the flash of movement she had seen near the shaded storefront of the candy store, slowly approaching its shiny glass doors. Inside, Blossom and Rill huddled tightly for cover behind the counter and clutched each other nervously, fearing the tall and muscular girl from 10. Haryana entered the store but once again narrowly missed seeing the girls as she scanned the area and brandished a kitchen whisk in a threatening manner. Slowly, Haryana retreated back out of the shop while muttering to herself that perhaps there were ghost mutts in the mall. Rill and Blossom appeared quite shaken but disentangled themselves a moment later, flushing bright red upon realizing how close they were. The girls separated and ate a quiet dinner of more seaweed rolls and water as they recovered from the day's events, settling in different corners of the area behind the counter and watching the fading sun through the stained glass dome on the mall concourse ceiling near them. As for Sorrel and Camellia, they experienced an overall uneventful day filled with monitoring the mall shops and charting the movements of the other tributes in the hopes that they could avoid them once they left the surveillance room. The pair continued to chug sparkling waters and even engaged in a belching contest, to the simultaneous amusement and revulsion of Capitol viewers. Lee appeared to have fallen ill and huddled in his clothing nest for almost the entire day. At night, the portraits of Tori from 6, Colonel from 9, and Colette from 15 were projected in each store and hallway for all tributes to see, leaving the final 16 tributes remaining. When dusk lightened to dawn on the third day, as most tributes continued to slumber in their respective mall stores, cameras captured Lee dashing out of the luxury clothing store and down the escalator to the fountain area, pulling a jacket tightly around his head and shoulders to disguise himself in the event of being spotted from afar. However, viewers and commentators alike were startled to see him entering the lingerie store just east of the fountain, until Rosalia commented that it was likely a way to avoid being found by other tributes, who were surely flustered by the idea of hiding in a lingerie store amid lacy bustiers and low-cut satin robes, and especially considering that Lee was not feeling well and needed a place to recover. Camera footage then focused inside the store, where Lee had found and was devouring another tribute's leftover hamburger and fries that had been set down on the checkout counter in the store. What Lee did not notice was Crinoline from 8, who had watched him enter the store from across the hallway and swiftly entered behind him before the doors had swung shut. She observed Lee digging into the food with an expression of polite disinterest, while camouflaging herself in the center of a large underwear display. Crinoline scrabbled her hand around the outside of the display and succeeded in grabbing a pair of lacy G-string underwear before tucking it into her pocket, sharply focusing in on the boy gorging himself a few feet away. The moment Lee turned around to find a new place to hide, Crinoline slipped out from inside the display and slid up behind him, gently tapping him on the shoulder. Lee jumped and turned around, emitting a startled noise that Rosalia could only describe as that of a cat being neutered. Crinoline hushed him, putting her hands out in a placating gesture, and although the cameras could not capture the tribute's facial expressions closely in the dim morning light, it appeared that she whispered something into Lee's ear that made him blush. Lee nodded and allowed Crinoline to lead him to a corner of the store, where the camera's view was partially obscured by a large rack of bras. While it was difficult to see what was going on, the camera's audio captured several grunts and what sounded like noises of intimacy, before a muffled cry and a choking noise. A moment later, Crinoline stood back up, half-dressed with her hair tangled and clothing slightly ripped, as a cannon sounded. She turned to the nearest camera, holding up the G-string, and winked as Lee's strangulated body was airlifted from the store. Further east, and securely settled in their management office hideout, Sorrel and Camellia were just waking up for the morning. The cannon had jolted them awake, although Camellia stirred for a few moments before falling back asleep. Sorrel dragged himself up and sat down at the computer bank, digging into some leftovers from the previous night as he began to explore some more of the settings housed within the computer applications and the nearby control panels. During this time, he noticed Oriel from 3 wandering around inside a bath and shower products store just a few feet from the central fountain. Sorrel leaned in, watching Oriel inspect soaps and cleansers with a calculating eye. As he continued to poke around the controls on the main computer, he suddenly froze. Cameras zoomed in on what looked like the water and plumbing settings for the bath products store pulled up on his screen, his cursor hovering over the water pressure bar. Sorrel squinted closely at Oriel, who was about to pick up a bath bomb from a display, and inhaled deeply before smoothly manipulating the controls to turn the water pressure in the shop all the way up and shut the doors. Instantly, there was a great creaking as the pipes operating the sinks in the bath supply store were overwhelmed with water, bursting each and every one of them and flooding the entire store. As the water level continued to rise, Oriel scrambled to get out and banged frantically against the front window. The water swirled with colors and scents as a result of sweeping up the many bath bombs and soaps on display in the shop, creating a dizzying convection of color and smell. The water from the damaged pipes continued to flood the room despite Oriel's desperate attempts to stand on tables and displays to avoid it, as well as the groaning door frames complaining about the pressure being applied to them from inside. Oriel hopped from table to table and counter to counter, but slipped on a stray bar of soap and fell onto her back. Her scream of pain and fright was cut off only seconds later by the massive tide of soapy water that washed over her and filled her lungs, choking the life from her. Sorrel bowed his head at the resulting cannon. However, his relief quickly turned to horror as he realized that the flood had pushed the door frames beyond their capabilities and was threatening to burst through the doors. Sorrel scrambled to turn down the water power, but just as he reached the control bar with his cursor, the great wave exploded through the doors and spilled out into the atrium, winding its way around and saturating the floor with bubbly water. One particularly strong tide of the wave burst into the candy store, sweeping an unsuspecting Blossom right off her feet and knocking her backwards onto her head as much of the water flooded into her lungs. Riel cried out and ran around the front of the counter as the water level settled in the shop, cradling Blossom's head and attempting to use cardiac resuscitation. After a moment, when she realized this was not working on the unconscious girl, she leaned down and began to provide mouth-to-mouth. Riel continued to pump with her hands and resuscitate Blossom with her mouth for several minutes, shoulders slumping as she appeared to lose steam along the way. She sadly leaned her forehead against Blossom's, too tired to lift her head and stop mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Suddenly, Riel felt a small fluttering against her cheeks and opened her eyes to reveal Blossom's dark eyes staring fuzzily at her. Riel's eyes widened in response, first with relief, then with embarrassment as she realized their lips were still locked. She jolted backwards and awkwardly struggled to slide off Blossom, but Blossom shook her head weakly and pulled the front of Riel's shirt back down, locking their lips again, this time with intention. The girls' lips met again and again, to the point where Rosalia suggested the camera should move away to give them some privacy, but they eventually parted and scurried back behind the counter, as Riel urged Blossom to eat some of their remaining bread and sip some water after their ordeal. The cameras moved back to Sorrel and Camellia as soon as Sorrel had managed to turn down the water pressure once more, a few moments after Riel and Blossom had begun to experience some of the flooding. Camellia was just waking up at this time, and Sorrel quickly sent her to get more food for them to avoid having her see the mess he had made, assuring her that he would keep an eye on the security footage while she was away. Not wanting to risk another incident like the flood, he closed out of the settings application and elected to simply sit and watch the various actions and behaviors of the other tributes. Of particular interest to Sorrel was the Career Alliance, who had split themselves up by gender to cover more ground while searching for other tributes. Despite the Career's commitment to stick together, while Azer from 1 and Josephus from 2 milled around contentedly in a cooking supply store and searched for weapons, Sunella from 1 and Adriana from 2 were in the middle of a loud argument in a perfume store. Apparently, the argument was about Adriana drinking a milkshake that Sunella had prepared at a restaurant for herself while gathering food for the Careers. Sunella was shouting at Adriana with almost no regard for if any other tributes could hear the argument, declaring that just because her milkshakes brought all the boys to the yard did not mean Adriana could have one. Adriana grumbled in response that she should not have left the milkshake sitting out if she expected to drink it, but this enraged Sunella even more, to the point of waving around a perfume bottle at Adriana and threatening to smash it on her. Adriana goaded and taunted Sunella, inviting her to throw the bottle because she believed her aim was so poor that it would miss her by several feet. Sunella did indeed hurl the bottle at Adriana, and missed as it sailed into a corner and smashed open, her hands shaking with fury. Adriana grinned maliciously back at Sunella and held out the nearest spray perfume bottle, remarking that Sunella certainly needed it for the amount of sweat she gave off. Sunella gasped in outrage, right as Adriana casually gave the bottle's pump a squirt and it spewed fresh summertime lemons into Sunella's open mouth. Sunella coughed, trying to wave off the spray and get it out of her mouth just as Adriana chuckled and laughed at her spluttering, commenting that she had finally found a way to make her ally shut up. Sunella's coughs quickly turned to wheezes, however, which also wiped the grin off Adriana's face. Without warning, Sunella keeled over backwards, lungs heaving. Rosalia commented quietly to viewers that the girls had not known it, but each perfume bottle in the room contained a highly lethal toxin which, when sprayed at the respiratory system, would ensure death within seconds. Sunella convulsed on the ground and heaved wildly, distressing Adriana, who retreated backward and appeared worried about the effects of her actions, while also nauseated at the unappealing spectacle unfolding in front of her. Sunella continued to writhe and squirm on the ground, eyes nearly popping out of her head, until at last she collapsed and her cannon sounded. Adriana stared at the ground in shock and with a degree of dizziness from the secondhand effects of the perfume. Wordlessly, she jerked around and hurried out of the perfume store, shaking her head as if shaking off the fogginess. Sorrel and Camellia spent most of the day making a hand-drawn map of the mall with supplies from around the office to aid them once they had to leave the room for good, getting creative with colors and shading. Rill and Blossom spent their day in a considerably less family-friendly manner, resulting in the camera footage of them on this day eventually being cut from the air in post-games commentary. In the evening, as false stars twinkled in the distance above the glass dome, the portraits of the fallen were shown in the sky. The remaining 13 tributes watched as the faces of Sunella from 1, Oriel from 3, and Lee from 4 were projected into each room and flickered off as the Anthem of Panem concluded. Rill appeared surprised but not too bothered at the loss of her district partner, assuring Blossom that she did not like men and would rather have been allied with her anyway. Sorrel watched over Camellia as she slept that night, appearing troubled but pensive as he occasionally glanced at the security feed. As the morning sun slowly drenched the atrium in soft light, the tributes began to awaken for the 4th day of the games. Rosalia remarked that today seemed like a good day for an arena event, although just as she was saying this, a loud buzzing and an explosion could be heard from the far eastern end of the mall. Rosalia hastily stopped talking to focus on the commotion occurring behind her on the screen, and squinted to try and see what was happening. The mall itself had one main central building connected to a secondary building by a glass-paneled walkway on the ground floor. It was in this secondary building that the explosion had occurred, the camera circling around a massage chair store, and the hovercraft picking up the charred remains of Spindle from 8. Most in Maze Square and around all of Panem were confused at this time, not understanding the cause of the explosion that had just killed Spindle, but Rosalia was handed a report by an off-screen intern and eagerly read it aloud for the benefit of all viewers. Rosalia read out that according to footage being reviewed at the moment by Capitol technicians, it was in fact Squeak from 3 who had tampered with all of the massage chairs in the entire store and rigged them to explode the moment another tribute turned them on. Spindle had been the unfortunate guinea pig of this experiment and was now paying the price, or rather the charred bits of him still left were. Only a few minutes later, once the confusion had been cleared up for viewers, head game makers Lock and Lock addressed the tributes. They announced in eerily echoing voices that within 1 hour, mall security robots known as Paulbots, named after their Capitol Mutt Lab creator Jove Paul, would be released into the arena from all sides, and that these robots would pursue any tribute they encountered along their patrol route. The head game makers advised all tributes to either hide or find a way to outsmart the intimidating Paulbots, warning them that failure to do so would surely result in a painful and violent death. Many tributes appeared frightened by the prospect of the security bots and cowered in place at this time. As the remaining tributes panicked and began to think about hiding places and ways to evade the imminent arrival of the Paulbots, Rosalia remarked that the tension in the arena was almost tangible from the commentator's booth. Sorrel and Camellia dug around in the office for any weapons they could find, emerging with a toolbox full of some basic wrenches, hammers, and screwdrivers. The pair nodded at each other and grimaced before pressing their ears to the walls to listen for any action that might be unfolding outside. Rill and Blossom skittered out of the candy store, worried that its proximity to the central fountain would be a hazard once the Paulbots were released, and hurried down the hallway and around a corner to an emporium for many varieties of pepper products. The girls glanced at each other, noting the presence of stacks upon stacks of bottles of hot sauce in the store, and gathering as many as they could in their arms. They hungered down behind a stack of crates in the store and anxiously awaited the release of the Paulbots. Moments later, every single tribute still alive heard a menacing whirring coming from all sides. The sound grew and grew in volume, evolving from whirring to grinding to a great roaring of machinery. As all tributes gazed in fear out at the approaching wave of Paulbots, many squeaked with fear or readied their weapons. The bots, made out of a shiny metal that gleamed in the late morning light and molded in the shape of real humans, rolled out on wheeled stands from all sides at every different endpoint of the mall. As they began scouring the area for tributes, the telltale whirring moving from area to area, even the remaining careers appeared spooked by their sharp metal arms and laser beam eyes. It was only a matter of minutes before one of the Paulbots found its first target, Sarah from 9. She had been crouching behind a playset in the children's playground zone, hoping to avoid the Paulbots while still staying in a central location. The bot approached the playset and poked its head under the slide, where Sarah was hiding. She ducked out of the way just in time, leaning the opposite direction, and the bot whirred over to the other side to check again. Once again, the bot poked its mechanical head down under the slide as Sarah ducked to avoid its gaze. The third time, however, it was too fast and reached out to spear Sarah with its razor-sharp prong hands. At the very last second, Sarah rolled out from under the playset and ran away, charging towards the nearest escalator. The Paulbot whirred and clicked in indignation at being evaded, before emitting what almost sounded like a whistle to call some of its comrades to help. Within seconds, a fleet of Paulbots joined the first one and began pursuing Sarah as she sprinted up the escalator. Yet the moment the first Paulbot reached the escalator and wheeled up onto a step, there was a great screeching of its wheels against the escalator stairs, stairs. The Paulbot, flailing around, keeled over backward and fell helpless onto the ground, arm prongs wiggling in a panic. The first Paulbot falling down had caused a domino effect, creating a pile-up several bots deep and eliciting a chorus of mechanical screeching and whirring from the bots involved. The smarter bots that had stayed at the back of the pack searched around for a way to continue pursuing Sarah, and one in the front pointed its prongs at the elevator several hundred yards away. Immediately, there was a stampede of Paulbots trying to be the first to the elevator, with those who could not fit inside being locked out and forced to wait or continue roaming the lower floor. As soon as the elevators opened and a crowd of Paulbots emerged right behind Sarah, she screamed and sprinted away from the whirring group. To cover more ground and potentially locate more tributes, the bots split up amongst themselves. Sarah, who had skirted around a corner and was running down a side corridor, began to cry as she heard a Paulbot bearing down on her from behind. Hitting a dead end and cowering at the end of the hall, she peeked through her hand, which she had used to cover her eyes, at the threatening robot zooming towards her. She squeezed her eyes shut once again as she prepared for its lethal prongs to impale her, until they did not. Sarah peeked back through her hand to find that just as the bot had been about to spear her, a screw had popped out near its base and it appeared to be malfunctioning. Sarah widened her eyes in surprise and hesitantly stepped forward, trying to determine if it was still possible for the bot to attack her. Instead, she appeared amazed to notice that it had powered down as a result of losing an internal part through the opening where the screw had come loose, and was glitching on and off. Sarah shrugged, smiling slightly to herself and cheerfully waving to the broken bot before hurrying off into a nearby apparel store. Back at the elevator, after the first group of Paulbots had dispersed onto the upper floor and the elevator was sinking back down to retrieve another group, none of the bots on either floor noticed a small and shadowed figure crouching on top of the elevator car. The next group of bots entered the elevator, and one extended a prong to hit the button for the second floor, but to the confusion of all the Paulbots present, it did not move an inch. Not even repeated stabbing of the buttons or tapping on the glass sides would force the elevator to rise. The bots then attempted to open the elevator doors to exit and try to find another elevator, although they quickly realized that these doors would not open either and they were trapped inside the elevator. With this realization came a plethora of mechanical screeching as the bots acknowledged the difficulty of their situation and began to trample each other in their panic. Squeak, from 3, hopped down from the top of the elevator car, grinned at the bots, and scurried away. Brill and Blossom were seen to be taking down several incoming robots with well-aimed sprays of hot sauce, while Sorrel and Camellia stood outside the management office and bashed any that approached their location. All in all, it appeared that the Paulbots had entered a fight that they certainly had no chance of winning when they attempted to interfere with the tributes in the arena. Rosalia frowned and declared that she believed clearly all of the budget for this year's games had been spent on the arena rather than the security bots, as the cameras appropriately zoomed in on the many ailing and malfunctioning Paulbots around the arena, including those trapped in the elevator. After several more minutes of Paulbots being corralled into submission, head game makers Lock and Lock hastily got on the mall-wide intercom to announce that the event was over, despite the bots having not even killed a single person. In fact, the only casualty was Josephus from 2, who had been taken advantage of by his ally Azer from 1 when a stampede of Paulbots had gone by and was whacked about the head repeatedly with a wok pan in the cooking store. Most tributes nursed their minor wounds for the rest of the day, much more amused than scared after the arrival and subsequent flop of the Paulbots. When evening fell and the portraits of the fallen were shown in the sky, many tributes appeared surprised to see that anyone had died during the strange day, let alone 2 people. The faces of Josephus from 2 and Spindle from 8 flickered on and off before the Anthem of Panem concluded for the night, and tributes began preparing for the 5th day of the games. With less than half the original tributes remaining, Rosalia and many other commentators remarked that the stakes were much higher, especially as the game makers would surely be looking to create more trouble to make up for the failure of the Paulbots the previous day. At the dawn of the 5th day, the cameras circled around the arena to find the 11 living tributes. Brill and Blossom had hunkered down in the Pepper Products store armed with hot sauce guns, while Sorrel and Camellia had waited out the Paulbot chaos in the safety of the management office. Sarah had settled in a boutique on the upper floor near the opening in which the central fountain was located and was treating herself to a bottled lemonade and a slice of cake from a nearby eatery for a delicious but unhealthy breakfast. Crinoline had fled to the far western end of the arena and settled in a hair salon, presumably to avoid further encounters with other tributes or Paulbots. Nimari and Haryana, the pair from 10, had chosen the opposite route and were at the far eastern wing of the arena, exploring around the various home furniture and home stores. The cameras took a while to find Squeak from 3, but eventually located him waking up in the bedding aisle of a pet store, having been small enough to fit inside a large dog bed for the night. The remaining careers, Azer and Adriana, prowled the halls and occasionally made disparaging comments about other tributes, especially on Adriana's part. In fact, one notable moment at this time in which Adriana compared Sarah to a blonde mole rat was one of the most watched videos on Capitol Tube after this year's games. The careers decided to explore the eastern wing, at times nearing the location of Nemaria and Haryana, but never drawing close enough to actually encounter them. The morning got off to a rather slow start for all tributes, as hardly anyone arose before it was nearly noon. Sorrel and Camellia played ping-pong with a balled-up wad of paper and 2 clipboards, while Rill and Blossom took turns spraying hot sauce at each other's faces while blindfolded and trying to see who could withstand the spiciest sauce blast. At one point, after several minutes into the hot sauce game, instead of spraying the next blast of hot sauce at a blindfolded Blossom's face, Rill leaned in and pressed a kiss to her lips, startling Blossom and making the blindfold fall askew on her forehead. After a moment, the two stepped apart, and Rill sadly held out a hand to Blossom, softly asking her if they would be able to make it to the end together. Blossom sighed and responded that it was unlikely, but that they could always try, promising Rill that she would do anything to get them both home alive to their families. When Rill replied that it was the Hunger Games and that only one could win, Blossom stared at the ground and spat at it before saying, "Screw that," and looking her in the eye once more. Rill took her hand, and the pair crouched back down behind a barricade of crates to continue their lookout. The cameras next moved to Sarah, who had finally completed her late breakfast and was roaming around the central balcony on the upper floor. One store that appeared to pique her interest in particular was the cosmetics store directly south of the Fountain Pavilion. Sarah gingerly stepped inside, feeling around with her toes for any hidden landmines or other traps, and clearly quite apprehensive after having seen the bath products store flood a few days prior. Once she realized that there were no hidden traps in the store, Sarah freely explored around its aisles and displays, appearing longing and wistful as she gazed at the contoured faces of the Capitol models plastered around the store. Coming across the poster of one especially striking model with knife-sharp eyeliner and a slick of ruby-red lipstick across their lips, Sarah reached out a hand and pressed it to the polished glass as if wishing to be in the model's place. Sarah searched around for the tools she would need to recreate the model's look on herself, locating a sleek eyeliner pen and mascara brush on a tall, rotating display tower near the poster. She combed through the shelves and racks to find the perfect shade of red for her lips. At last, after a vigorous search of the majority of the store that involved turning over countless tables and making a mess of the neatly arranged shelving, Sarah located her crown jewel, a crimson tube with a glossy silver cap. Setting to work in front of a large display mirror opposite the checkout counter, Sarah clumsily applied the eyeliner and mascara. Although Rosalia admitted that as generous as she would have liked to be towards the makeup challenge Sarah, she still looked like a spooked and slightly hungover raccoon. Finally, after around a half hour of toiling away at her eyes, Sarah uncapped the lipstick and held it up to admire it in the store's stark white lights. It was truly a marvel of Capitol beauty products, tinted a brilliant scarlet and pointed perfectly at the end. Yet what really made the lipstick stand out was its interior. While the tip itself was bright red, the red faded into a clear gloss below, and preserved in this gloss was a perfectly real, tiny red poppy bloom. Sarah ogled the bloom inside with excitement and wonder before shrugging and smearing the lipstick all over her mouth. Rosalia, who had already been cringing at Sarah's poor makeup application skills before, began to bang her head against her desk at this point, and dramatically asked an intern for a water bottle, as she was feeling faint upon seeing how Sarah quickly destroyed the elegant lipstick tube. It was only a matter of seconds before Sarah realized that something was horribly, horribly wrong. The red lipstick smeared around her mouth was no longer glittering benevolently, now gleaming with a threatening shine that had not seemed to be present earlier when she was examining the tube. Sarah gasped and whispered aloud to herself that she had just wished to be pretty for once, as tears streamed down her cheeks, before choking and clutching her throat from the poison that had been contained within the lipstick. She fell to her knees and emitted several wild, hacking coughs, before crumpling and passing out of consciousness as her body twitched in an unsightly manner. Sarah's cannon sounded almost immediately after her body stopped moving. Most tributes were startled out of their relaxed attitudes by this cannon, as even Sorrel got whacked in the eye by the paper ping-pong ball when he looked away from the game for a moment and Camellia fired a sneaky shot at him. The rest of the day passed without event until evening began to fall and the arena was bathed in a sunset glow. Azer and Adriana finally stumbled into the mattress store where Nemaria and Haryana had settled for the day and were quickly drawn inside by a loud noise coming from the corner. Azer glanced at Adriana, but she was already indicating for him to stay back and inching toward the noise with her baseball bat. Azer moved back to guard the exterior of the store while Adriana moved inward with her baseball bat raised at the direction of the noise. Camera operators, viewers, and Adriana alike were all completely shocked as to what came into focus next. As Adriana rounded the corner of a bank of mattresses, she observed Nemaari and Haryana loudly being intimate on a mattress bed. Adriana's jaw dropped in shock and she almost dropped the baseball bat on the floor, but caught it at the last second. Nemaari and Haryana were clearly too occupied to notice the presence of another tribute in their vicinity, giving Adriana time to recover and look around. Adriana noted that the particular mattress occupied by Nemaari and Haryana seemed to be the variety that was temperature and firmness controlled, meaning that there had to be a remote of some kind somewhere. To Adriana's disappointment and frustration, she noticed that this remote was right underneath Nemaari's right shoulder, close to her, but also at risk of being lost or Adriana being caught trying to take it because Nemaari was moving. Gritting her teeth and wincing, she inched forward and tried to block out the sounds around her. Rosalia remarked that the noises sounded a bit alarming even for intimacy, and slyly joked to the camera operator in her commentary room that she could do better. Squeezing her eyes shut, Adriana wriggled her fingers onto the mattress underneath Nemaari's shoulder at a moment when he was slightly raised from the surface. Inspecting it in the slight evening light reflecting in from the hall, Adriana observed that there were 5 buttons, 2 for temperature control, 2 for firmness control, and a large red one at the bottom of the remote that read, "Do not touch." Having no patience for the salacious acts occurring in front of her, Adriana's finger immediately flew to the red button and she hit it with an air of finality. As most of Panem held their breath, the mattress containing the 2 tributes seized up and snapped its ends together with such force that it crushed both of them in the middle. Adriana grinned as 2 cannons sounded in unison, casting aside the remote and shaking her head as if shaking off the memory of what she had just witnessed between the 2 tributes. Striding out of the store, she dusted off her hands and invited Azer to join her in celebrating the double kill, suggesting that they enjoy some food from a food court and sleep in the comfort of a department store bedding section. Azer eagerly agreed, although he appeared wary of Adriana after she had caused 2 kills at the same time. The careers progressed back the way they had come and found a large department store in which to settle for the night after grabbing some food at the luxury food court on their way out. Sorrel and Camellia had appeared intrigued by the double cannons, but seemed even more relieved that they were safe and had so far been undisturbed in the management office. Once again, Camellia fetched them some food for the night, and they fell asleep shortly after watching the portraits of the fallen against the plain gray wall. Rill and Blossom appeared unnerved after hearing the cannons of the pair from 10 and huddled to discuss it in hushed tones. During this time, Blossom began to complain to Rill that her back hurt from sleeping on wooden floors for 5 nights straight. While Rill appeared somewhat irritated that her ally was bothered by something so trivial, she still asked the Sky politely for sponsor gifts, but her call went unheeded, and the girls determined that they needed to find a place with actual beds to sleep in so that Blossom could be more comfortable. Rosalia murmured as the girls left the pepper store that they appeared to be heading right into the same department store as Azer and Adriana. She glanced over at the screen behind her and rubbed her hands together, eager to see if the 2 groups would run into each other while in the store. In fact, as Rill and Blossom entered the department store, Azer turned slightly and frowned from around the corner, almost noticing their shadows in the doorway. However, any further investigation was deterred by the showing of the deceased tributes' portraits against the department store wall. As all of the remaining tributes watched, they saw the faces of Sarah from 9, Nemaari from 10, and Haryana from 10 flash across the wall while the anthem of Panem played and flashed off as it concluded. While the anthem was still playing, Azer narrowed his eyes and slipped off into the darkness, unnoticed by even Adriana, who had been standing only a few feet away from him. She failed to notice he had returned by the end of the anthem and invited him to follow her to the bedroom furnishings section to each find a show bed to settle on for the night. Azer agreed, and although Rosalia noted that she thought it looked like he was holding something behind his back, it was difficult to tell with the angle of their shadows. As Adriana and Azer wandered further into the store, Rill and Blossom obliviously followed them without realizing they were there. The girls ended up by pure coincidence settling in the living room furnishings area adjacent to the bedroom furnishings space, though neither group heard nor saw each other. Despite the close proximity of 2 pairs of tributes, all was peaceful in the arena for a while that night. However, out of nowhere at around 3 in the morning, night vision cameras captured Azer silently sliding out of his bed, holding what seemed to be a forearm-sized, chunky object. Many viewers in Mace Square who were pulling all-nighters during the games squinted to try and determine what the object was, but no one could identify it because it was so dark and braced against his body. Azer felt around to smoothly navigate his way through the shelves of down comforters and hypoallergenic pillowcases, freezing when he tripped on the side of one and Adriana snuffled loudly in her sleep. Azer crept out of the bedroom furniture section and around a corner into the living room furniture section, managing to make out the sleeping figures of Rill and Blossom snuggled up on a pull-out couch. He cocked his head and seemed to be debating which of them to attack, before smiling to himself and pulling up the object he was holding. As one side of it flashed in the reflective lens of the night vision cameras, viewers cried aloud to each other in Mace Square that it seemed to be a pair of ice skates. Azer whipped out one of the skates and held it up by the heel, brandishing the sharpened blade. In one sweeping motion, he sliced it down and across Blossom's throat, having judged her to be stronger. Instantly awakening and choking on her own blood, Blossom began to weakly cry out and thrash around as Azer stepped back and surveyed the scene to make sure she was actually dying. Instead, Blossom's cries and movement woke up Rill, who cried out at the warm, wet blood pooling around her and leaped up. Upon squinting through the dark to see that Blossom's throat had been slashed and she was rapidly losing consciousness and air, Rill cast around to find who had done such a thing to Blossom. Noticing Azer standing over Blossom and preparing to strike her again with one of the skates, Rill's eyes flashed and she seized the nearest large object she could find, a large table lamp. Blossom's cannon sounded, but it could hardly be heard over the great crack of Rill beating Azer upside the head with the lamp with surprising strength. Azer fell forward and Rill physically shoved him off Blossom, beating him over and over again with the lamp until his cannon sounded. She cast the lamp aside and ran to Blossom, who was rapidly fading. Rill began to cry and whispered to Blossom that she wished she could have saved her again, pressing her head to the other girl's faintly beating heart and sighing as her cannon sounded. She took her lifeless hand and pressed one last kiss to it, promising she would do anything to win. With this, Rill heard the stirring of Adriana in the next section over and darted through the aisles out of the store. Sorrel watched all of this occurring from the management office, where it was his shift on guard for the night. He watched the tiny but limber figure of Rill dart out of the department store, followed a minute later by the larger and bulkier figure of Adriana. Sorrel's fingers flew to the mouse, debating whether to unleash one of the mall's many hazards on the two tributes, but he sat back a moment later and decided to watch how events played out. As he watched, Rill turned a corner and continued sprinting down the main hall and up an escalator. She dived behind a large display in a jewelry store and crouched behind it, breathing heavily. Adriana was in hot pursuit and vaulted up the escalator just seconds after her prey. Rill noticed that the display behind which she was hiding had a glass center to display several rings and necklaces. Panicking as she realized Adriana was approaching the jewelry store, Rill propped herself up on an elbow and gave a winsome smile, apparently attempting to blend in as a jewelry model in the backdrop of the display. To many viewers' shock, this actually worked, as Adriana stomped around the jewelry store for a minute before grunting and leaving to search other stores. Rill let out a sigh of relief as Sorrel began to laugh from the management office upon noticing that Adriana had started to throw a bit of a temper tantrum once she checked several more rooms and found no sign of Rill. Stamping her feet, she angrily kicked a plastic water bottle that was on the ground in the hall at a nearby trash receptacle, eliciting a mocking gasp from Sorrel and causing him to joke she didn't recycle. At this very moment, as Adriana leaned on the balcony railing and tried to calm down from her anger, she was nearly bowled over from behind by a figure running around the corner. Crinoline, after strangling Lee on the third day, had been laying low and hiding in various different stores for the past 3 days, evading other tributes and leaving her many shelters at the first sign of danger. However, as she skittered around the corner fleeing from a rogue Paulbot with a slightly askew police cap and razor-sharp arms, her first concern was clearly not subtlety. Crinoline barreled right into Adriana from behind, making her trip forward and whip around in confusion. The moment Adriana realized she had just been knocked into by a cannon waiting to happen, she grinned savagely and turned around. Eyeing Crinoline up like a falcon eyeing its prey, Adriana began to circle her as she stood paralyzed in fear. The Paulbot that had been chasing her promptly derailed and whirled into a nearby clothing display, smoking and beeping faintly. Without warning, Adriana charged forward and muscled a struggling Crinoline to the edge of the balcony before stepping up onto one of the couches in the hallway and hurling her with all her strength over the side. Crinoline screamed, a high-pitched and shrill noise that sent shivers down even the most ruthless capital citizen's spine. A sickening cracking was heard, and a cannon moments later amid the sunrise. 5 remaining. Uneasy at the sound of the cannon, Sorrel and Camellia exchanged glances from the management office. Sorrel quietly murmured to Camellia that with just 5 tributes remaining, and 2 being themselves, they would need to leave the office soon or risk being caught by surprise by one of the other remaining tributes. Camellia softly replied that she did not want to have to fight Sorrel at the final 2, and agreed to his idea. Bracing themselves, they each picked up a stapler and pair of scissors, leaning against the door to listen for voices or footsteps and slowly turning it open. The pair sprinted down the hall to another department store and embedded themselves in the winding aisles of its greeting card section, right next to the party supply section. Sorrel reasoned to Camellia that they would easily be able to hear anyone coming from within the maze of aisles, warning her that they needed to be on high alert for other tributes. He instructed her to keep a lookout at the opposite end, the eastern side of the greeting card aisles, while he covered the western side. Camellia nodded and proudly brandished her stapler and scissors, making Sorrel chuckle as she scurried off. Sorrel crouched against the far western blockade of greeting cards, tensed and ready for any tribute that might enter the store near him, though he began to grow tired of waiting only a few minutes into his watch. After around 10 minutes, he resorted to leaning against the card display and tapping his head against the side. Suddenly behind him there was a great commotion of shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor, and a muffled shriek. Sorrel froze and slowly turned, creeping back the way he had come and tentatively whispering Camellia's name. There was no response. Eyes darting around, Sorrel called her name again, slightly louder. Again, there was no response. He turned the corner as his heart began to thump louder against his chest and in his ears. Sorrel turned another corner, calling her name once more, not even bothering to hide the panic and fear in his trembling voice. Once again, Camellia did not answer. Sorrel turned the final corner to the far end of the greeting card section bordering the party supply section, where Camellia had been on lookout. His heart dropped as he saw a broken pair of scissors on the floor, blades snapped apart. A few feet away, a mangled stapler rested on the ground, bent at an angle with all the staples either on the floor or falling out. Sorrel's hands began to shake, his knuckles turning white around his scissors and stapler, but he continued forward as if pulled by an invisible string. Turning another corner and stopping just inside the party section, he let out a strangled cry and dropped his weapons, sinking to his knees and weeping. A single large balloon, printed with a cheery happy birthday in bright primary colors surrounded by jaunty confetti, hovered a few feet above the tiled floor. Attached to it was a thin pink string running down several feet, and attached to the end of this pink string was the gently lolling neck of Camellia Bishop. She appeared peaceful even as her face was ashy, washed out in the unforgiving and stark ceiling lights. Even the pink ribbon tied tightly around her neck and her toes dangling slightly above the ground could not diminish the overwhelming calm that had fallen over her, no longer worried about the games or survival, but about floating up and away into safety and light. Sorrel let out a choked wail again and buried his face in his hands, as a cannon sounded in the distance to signify that Camellia had managed to fly away at last. Sorrel had not seen Adriana enter the store, nor had he seen her leave. Yet after what he had seen of her so far on the mall security cameras, he had a frighteningly correct sense that she had been the cause of this. Adriana, in the meantime, had no time for crying over spilled milk or blood. She sprinted out of the department store, having watched the pair from 11 run into it from her post on the balcony. Dusting her hands off after the death of the little girl, but not wishing to get into a scuffle with the smarter and more careful boy while she was fatigued and sleep-deprived, she headed to the east wing of the arena. This area was overall mostly deserted, save for one girl from District 4 skittering down the escalator to the lower level of the eastern wing. Rill heard Adriana on the floor above, cursing loudly after tripping on one of her own shoelaces and falling down on the balcony. Panicked, Rill darted down another escalator to the first floor to put as much space between herself and Adriana as possible, zooming directly into the first store she saw beyond the base of the escalator. This turned out to be a pottery store, where she scanned the room for a moment and dived into a large pot on the floor, wriggling around for a moment before settling in. She listened for any sign of life from the area in front of the shop, but there was none for the rest of the day. After the morning's action, the afternoon and evening passed quickly and without much event, other than Adriana being sponsored a sharp dagger to her delight. Rill remained in the pottery store for the rest of the day and nibbled on her slightly moldy seaweed rolls, while Adriana roamed the many halls and stayed on her guard for any sign of other tributes, eventually settling in a luxury store next to the food court. Sorrel refused to stay in the department store after seeing Camellia's corpse and instead settled himself at a business clothing store in the central wing, at one point almost coming close to encountering Adriana, but barely missing running into her by a few minutes. Squeak, the only living tribute who had not received much camera coverage in the games, was seen to be hiding in a potted plant. In the evening, the portraits of Azer from 1, Blossom from 7, Crinoline from 8, and Camellia from 11 were shown in the sky as the Anthem of Panem played once more. Rosalia commented that the final four appeared to be a toss-up, with all four remaining tributes having utilized a different but unique strategy that had benefited them in the games up to this point. She went on to ponder which of their four strategies would work in the end, signing off for the night and leaving Capital audiences themselves to wonder which of the tributes would pull off the win this year in what had been an extremely eventful game so far. The seventh day dawned to a surprisingly gloomy morning sky outside the Atrium Dome, streaked with silvery clouds and with heavy rain pattering down on top of the mall. The 4 remaining tributes slowly awoke over the course of the morning and stretched, preparing for the day's events. Rill was seen to be crying in her sleep and calling out for Blossom. As Rosalia commented, it was lucky no other tributes were nearby to hear her sleep talking. Sorrel appeared uneasy and tense as he rose from under a pile of tuxedos and pantsuits that had been serving as his blankets for the night, cracking his neck and knuckles. Squeak had to take a minute and shake out several parts of his body after spending the night squatting in a potted plant, while Adriana had enjoyed a peaceful night in a furniture store and cheerfully polished off a slice of cheesecake for breakfast. No tribute moved locations until Adriana got bored and decided to patrol around the East Wing around mid-afternoon. She casually circled the upper floor, finding nothing and no one of interest, before doing the same to the floor below. In the East Wing, there was a lower level that was on the same level as the basement of the Central Wing, where Rill's pottery shop was located and where Adriana decided to explore next on her patrol. Rill snuffled awake just as the looming figure of Adriana entered the hallway outside the pottery store. Neither girl appeared aware of the other's presence, Rill yawning loudly and Adriana sleepily twisting her hair into 2 thick braids. Adriana poked her head inside the shop and performed a routine check of its shelves and displays. Meanwhile, Rill's eyes widened as she realized she was not alone anymore. Her eyes continued to widen as it became apparent that she very much had to sneeze. Adriana continued roaming around, giving everything in the room a cursory glance out of boredom and preparing to leave. The moment her first foot was out the door, Rill, who had been watching from inside her clay pot, let out an explosive sneeze. Yet she had miscalculated that Adriana could indeed hear the sneeze from the doorway, and the girl from 2 turned around with a vicious grin, while Rill fished around in her pockets frantically for anything that might be thrown to distract Adriana. She happened to come across a pair of elegant, teardrop-shaped diamond earrings that she had forgotten she stashed in her pockets while in the jewelry store hiding from Adriana the previous day. Rill peeked out to see if there was an opportunity, but Adriana was too fast and smiled darkly upon noticing Rill's head poking out of the pot in the corner. In a flash of motion, she sprinted forward and grabbed Rill by the neck, threatening to choke her with just her bare hands. Rill spluttered and let out a strangled scream, railing against the clay pot and trying to knock it over so she could escape. She quickly began to lose consciousness, the earrings falling back into her pocket as Adriana pressed her fingers tighter and began to crush her windpipe, taking great joy in prolonging the pain. Rill's screams were silenced by the fingers closing around her throat, and just as she was about to completely pass out, she felt the fingers around her throat loosen and the pressure holding her in place lift off her. Massaging her throat, Rill looked around to see what had saved her, only to see tiny little Squeak from 3 standing behind and grinning at Adriana, whose head had just been dunked inside a clay pot from behind as she blindly stumbled around the store. Adriana uttered a string of profanities that would be censored on all later aired versions of the games, while Rosalia urged parents around Pan Am to cover their children's ears. This string of words included a very graphic description of what she planned to do to Squeak and Rill once she was free of the clay pot on her head, although she never got to finish describing this due to the fact that she tripped on her own feet and fell face first onto the floor. Rill thanked Squeak for the help as he assisted her to get out of her own clay pot, before they each selected a small glazed ceramic pot of their own to use, and on the count of 3 brought their pots crashing down on Adriana's back. The pots were not the only thing shattering, as Adriana shrieked breathlessly and realized a shard had pierced her lung. Squeak and Rill soon brought down another pair of pots on her heart, sounding her cannon in seconds. The pair of tributes exhaled in relief as they watched Adriana's body being carted away and exited the store. Rill asked if Squeak needed anything to eat or drink, offering a moldy roll to him. Squeak looked a bit nauseated and politely declined as Rill ruffled his sandy blonde hair and thanked him once more for saving her from Adriana. He admitted that he preferred his chances against her to his chances against Adriana in a fight, which seemed to simultaneously please and annoy Rill due to its implications of her weakness. Squeak hastily apologized, but there was still an awkwardness hanging in the air for several minutes afterward as they headed up the escalators to the Central Wing. They wandered through the great glass outdoor walkway that connected the 2 large portions of the mall and turned right, all the way down the hall past the candy store where Rill and Blossom had sheltered early on in the games. They continued looking around for any sign of Sorrel, but he was nowhere to be found. Squeak quickly became distracted by a novelty store and joyfully darted inside, calling out to Rill that he had never heard of a macaroni cooker, but that the store contained one he found quite fascinating. Rill chuckled as she watched Squeak clatter around with the various gadgets and novelties in the store, looking around for another store in which she herself could do some shopping. Sorrel heard the other 2 tributes in the hall behind the businessware store and carefully prepared his stapler and scissors for attack. Creeping out of the store and around the corner, he watched Squeak enter the novelty store, and Vril poking around several different storefronts. However, Sorrel chose to stay back and observe from his safe vantage point, debating the likelihood of the pair turning on each other before they came for him. He inhaled deeply and pressed his fingers to his temples, trying to decide. After several moments of internal conflict, Sorrel pressed himself back against the wall and affirmed to himself that he would stay hidden as long as possible. Vril disappeared into a tiny side corridor, and he seemed apprehensive to follow her, hesitantly staying tucked behind the wall next to a strip of stores. As viewers across Panem could see, Vril had just discovered something that neither other tribute had noticed, the mall security office. She crept inside and peered around for a moment as her eyes fell on a brand new, shiny Segway motor vehicle at the rear of the office. Vril's eyes lit up in excitement, and she scurried toward the Segway, eagerly powering it on and stepping up onto its footholds while flexing her fingers on the polished handlebars. The next thing Sorrel heard in the hallway was a loud whirring, followed by a crash and a thud. Though neither Sorrel nor Squeak could see it, Vril had fallen off the Segway and landed on her bottom. After a few more moments of figuring out how to maneuver the Segway, she was finally able to drive it without falling off. Vril came tearing out of the mall security office with a wild grin on her face, calling for Squeak to see the treasure she had found and shouting with great relish that she finally felt as if she had control for the first time in her life. Squeak dropped his macaroni cooker and scampered to the front of the store just as Vril rolled out of the mall security office. However, she had misjudged the speed she needed to be going in order to cleanly meet Squeak in the middle of the hall. Vril shot forward out of the security office, screaming her head off as the Segway zoomed directly at Squeak. He screamed as well and tried to dive out of the way, but she had let go of the handlebar in her fright, and the Segway hurtled at him, knocking him down and throwing Vril onto him. There was a sickening crunch and a thud as Vril flopped off of Squeak, and the Segway derailed into a nearby pillar. Nursing a throbbing head, Vril turned to Squeak and began to panic as she realized blood was pooling around his head, and he was unresponsive to her frantic efforts at calling out his name and checking under his eyelids. She began to perform the same resuscitation procedure she had performed earlier on Blossom, but it was to no avail. Vril wept over Squeak's limp body and pounded her fists against the ground amid tears, frustrated at her own stupidity and pleading for him to stay with her. Sorrel watched this from afar with a cool gaze, clearly judging if he had the opportunity to sneak in and steal the Segway. Without warning, a cannon sounded and a hovercraft claw swept in through a store window to collect the tiny frame of Squeak, leaving just a bright red pool of blood on the floor and a sobbing girl behind. Sorrel used the commotion as an opportunity to sprint out from behind the wall and make for the Segway, although Vril spotted him and stuck out a leg to trip him up, tears fading to anger. She got up, hobbled past Sorrel to seize the Segway from the pillar, and hopped on despite her clearly injured leg after the crash just moments earlier. Vril powered forward on the Segway and zipped around the corner, calling out to Sorrel and challenging him to pursue her as she revved the vehicle and whirled away, wind whipping through her greasy hair. Sorrel cast around for another vehicle to ride, seeing as there were no more Segways in the mall, and his gaze fell upon a nearby Paulbot, slowly puttering around in the hallway. He grimaced but hopped onto the back of it anyway, piggyback style, banging on the top of its metal police cap with his hand to get it moving. As if slapped like a horse or cow, the Paulbot reared back and zoomed forward to pursue Vril. Sorrel appeared slightly nauseated by the bumpy ride as Rosalia noted that it seemed as if he were reconsidering his choice to board the Paulbot and wondering if it would be faster running. Still, the Paulbot continued to roll forward in hot pursuit of Vril and her Segway, a fact that even Sorrel could not complain about. Vril turned around from the Segway and threw something back at him, spurring on the Segway to keep moving forward and appearing determined to mow down any obstacles. Confused, Sorrel reached out to catch the thrown object but hastily dropped it. The item she had thrown to him was a sharp diamond earring, which then pricked him in the palm of his right hand and drew blood, enough blood to force him to man the Paulbot with only one hand while he used his shirt to staunch the blood flow from the other. Despite this, Sorrel urged his Paulbot on and navigated it through trash cans, potted plants, and other hazards on the mall floors. Vril blew a kiss from up ahead and skirted into a side corridor, while Sorrel growled in frustration and tried to get his Paulbot to turn right. She did a loop around a few stores, grinning with a sort of jouissance as Sorrel struggled to even get his Paulbot to change direction, cursing loudly at it with such colorful language that Mayor Gardner swore in District 11 that his son would be grounded if he came back alive. Finally, as the Paulbot turned around to face the direction it had previously been going, Vril circled back around to the far western end of the mall so that they were both equidistant from the central fountain in the atrium. As Sorrel kicked his Paulbot once more to start charging, Vril zoomed forward and landed the Segway on one step of the nearest escalator to the upper level. The Paulbot zipped around the corner but began to protest in a series of whirs and squeaks when Sorrel tried to get it to go up the escalator, digging its wheels into the floor. Rosalia reminded viewers that one of the Paulbot's apparent known malfunctions was that they could not go up or down stairs, creating a dilemma and instilling fear when pressed by a tribute to traverse some stairs or an escalator. Sorrel quickly grew frustrated with his Pawbot and rapped his fist against the side of its metal head, demanding to know if there was anything in there or just air. The Pawbot did not take kindly to this and began to spin around, trying to buck off its unwelcome rider. Sorrel held on tightly and kicked the side of it, denting the cheap metal on its body. The pair continued to struggle for a moment until the Pawbot finally managed to spin around enough times for Sorrel to get dizzy and bucked him off into the central fountain, drenching him in cold water and sending his pride and dignity down the fountain drain. Sorrel slumped out of the fountain in frustration. He hardly had time to push his sopping wet hair out of his eyes before a metal shape whizzed past him down the escalator and came barreling into the far side of the atrium. It was Rill, smiling and thanking him for putting on a show for her while she had watched from upstairs. Sorrel scowled and refused to answer her on this remark, wiping water droplets from his face. Suddenly, as Rill began to say that wet hair was a good look on him, Sorrel charged her and tackled her on the Segway. The two fought for control of the Segway, hands and legs flying amid grunts and groans of pain. At last, after several minutes of a scuffle, Sorrel staggered backward with something tiny and silver embedded in the side of his throat, a teardrop-shaped diamond earring with the wire curved slightly to resemble a fish hook. Without hesitating, Rill lunged forward onto the Segway, wincing at her injured leg, and revved it up before zooming off, turning around, and speeding back towards Sorrel. Eyes narrowed and flashing brightly, she charged on the Segway like a war general on a mechanized horse and ran over Sorrel's exposed body as he tried to free the earring from his neck, gritting her teeth in determination and muttering Blossom's name as she called out apologetically to him that she wanted to win so that she never had to eat rotten shellfish again. Rosalia gasped from her commentator booth, as did most of Mace Square, at the prospect of eating expired food. As the girl slowly turned around and dismounted from the Segway, spitting out some blood and a molar tooth that had gotten knocked from its spot by Sorrel, the final cannon of this year's games sounded, and Rill Rivulet of District 4 was declared to be the victor of the 107th Hunger Games. She offered a bloody smile and calmly stated that she could buy up the entire arena now, spreading her arms wide as if imagining drowning in money. A Capitol hovercraft soon arrived to escort her out as she laughed and gleefully flipped off one of the cameras, though she had to be helped up into it due to a slight limp. Rill was found to have sustained a tweaked knee in the final fight, as well as several cuts, scrapes, and bruises, and her knocked-out tooth. After a short stay in one of the Capitol's top hospitals, she was cleared to be released for her victor's interview with a knee brace. For this interview, Rill's black hair was lightly curled, with the front two strands of her hair dyed a seafoam green and pulled back with a barrette. She also revealed that she had gotten a tattoo on her right upper arm, which was in the shape of a few small starfish and captioned with the words, "Keep growing," in a neat script below. Capitol fashion editors later remarked that a true glow-up had occurred from the dirty girl at the reapings to the classy victor seated in the studio. She wore a soft blue dress that cascaded like waves around her, and a boa made entirely of dollar bills sewn together, politely acknowledging the applause from the crowd. Rosalia arrived in a fashionable yellow jumpsuit, which she said had been one of the very ones on display in one of the arena's luxury stores. She sat down with Rill and declared that this year's games had been one of her favorites to watch so far, with all of the action and suspense among the tributes, announcing her nickname to be the Mall Mauler. She went on to say that she had been quite moved by Rill and Blossom's relationship, comparing it to that of second incarnation victor Mirai Kobayashi and her lover in the arena, Lilac Cannon. Rill replied that she had truly grown attached to Blossom in the arena, and that it was her who had inspired Rill to keep going each day and fight until the end, especially after Blossom's untimely death at the hands of Azer. In addition, her conversations with the girl had shown her that while money was quite helpful to having a good life in Panem, the only other thing that could improve it was being loved. Rosalia continued to inquire about Rill's actions both in the games and now that she had won, asking what she planned to do with her winnings and fame. Rill answered that she would buy her mother a real shop so they could sell their seashell jewelry together without suffering outside in the heat anymore as they had done for years, and that she hoped to be a good mentor to future tributes, adding that even if she was not the best role model, she wanted to instill in them the desire to win against all odds. After some further banter and Rill expressing her thanks to the Capitol, the interview was concluded and she was permitted to leave in order to allow time for the interviews of head game makers Locke and Locke. The head game makers arrived in sharp pinstripe suits with sunglasses, despite the fact that they were indoors and the stage lights were by no means overpowering. Rosalia appeared too intimidated by their attire to ask about their reasoning for wearing sunglasses in the studio, and instead hurriedly commenced their interview, learning that the head game makers had wanted to replicate their success with an indoor arena the prior year and had gone all out this year to test out their new skills. They added that the following year they would be trying something new to see if they could find another formula in addition to their current one that worked and produced games that the Capitol enjoyed. Surprisingly, the head game makers were much quieter this year than in the past year during their post-games interview, keeping their mouths sealed tightly shut and only revealing minimal information about their overall plans for the next year. Rosalie dismissed them shortly after, waving to the audience and concluding for the night with her characteristic "Goodnight, Panem," as she reminded viewers to check Capital fashion magazines for the possible addition of indoor sunglasses as a stylish new trend. Rill returned home to District 4 and bought her mother a brand new store to sell their shell jewelry, spending most of her free time in this store interacting with customers and helping her mother craft intricate earrings, necklaces, bracelets, and rings. She was known for her love of long walks on the beach, as well as her caring nature when mentoring future tributes. Rill did not marry or have children, but she reportedly treated her future mentees like her own children. It was also well known that because of her increased social mobility since her victory, Rill was often indulgent, materialistic, and enjoyed the finer things in life, including but not limited to fresh caviar, European chocolate, multicolored feather boas, and overly expensive sunglasses. Despite her reputation as a careless spender with questionable ethical judgment, Rill was one of the first to offer financial aid when a tsunami hit part of District 4 a few years after her victory. She enjoyed a close friendship with Heifer Muller, as they were both known for their extravagance, often attending parties together and reportedly becoming their own stand-up comedy act when they were drunk. Perhaps Rill's crowning moment was her front-page cover of a Capital fashion magazine, in which she and Heifer posed topless with their famous money boas, diamond earrings, and golden golf clubs. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this installment of Pan Am Reborn, File 107. I definitely don't think it was my best. I think I could have done better, but I'm hoping to improve for future games. I definitely have a lot more surprises up my sleeve in the future. And don't forget, next week we're going to have a Q&A after the episode. I already recorded the Q&A, but it'll be at the end of next week's episode. So please remember to stick around next time to wait for that to happen, to get your questions answered. And I guess join the Discord, otherwise Mercury Valens will yoink you with an earring. No, wait. Why did I say Mercury Valens? I meant Real Rivulet. Real Rivulet will yoink me with an earring. And other than that, I don't really have anything to say. So, Pan Am today, Pan Am tomorrow, Pan Am forever.